So now we're going to add a secondary animation control to this entire head, what I call a smear control. Basically, it's just a wire deformer, but it's going to be layered so that it will trigger last in the deformation hierarchy. So whatever skin cluster weights or blend shapes you have activated on your face, once you've done that, then on top of that, last in the deformation chain, you'll be able to layer more global deformations on top of the face. And once we set this up, you'll see that the smear deformer can be used for just that, very quick moves of the head, where on a frame or two you want to sort of blur and stretch the geometry to match 2D blur, that type of technique. So setting up is pretty straightforward. We're going to switch to a side view. And starting at the base of the jaw and going to the just outside the edge of the bottom lip, we're going to draw a 1-degree curve. We'll start by selecting Create, CV Curve tool. Let's open the option box. We have our curve degree set to linear. Then I'll click the first CV, and then the second. So I'm going to display the CVs. In this case, with the curve selected, I'm going to open the attribute editor, Control A, and then click on the component display pane and turn on display CV. So now we can see the two CVs on our 1-degree curve. So now that we have a straight line, we're going to rebuild this curve to a 3rd-degree curve so that we have more resolution on both ends and the center, so that we can actually bend or add curvature to this control. So with our 1-degree curve still selected, switch to the modeling module and select Edit Curves, Rebuild. Let's open the option box. So I'm going to change the parameter range 0 to number of spans. You could also leave it to 0 to 1. The parameter range isn't overly important in this rebuild function. The two main things we want to make sure to change are the number of spans. In this case, we're going to change that to 2. And the degree, we're going to rebuild this to a 3rd degree or cubic curve. Let's hide the head for a second. Hit Rebuild. So now you can see we have a 3rd degree curve with 2 spans and a total of 5 CVs. I'm going to switch my selection mask so that I can only select curves. So now that we have this, we're going to create, I toggled on meshes as well. So now that we have this created, we're going to create a wire deformer. Show our head geometry. We can do that by switching back to the animation module and selecting Deform, Wire tool, which puts our cursor into a context selection mode. We'll click on the mesh first and hit the return key, and then click on the curve that will serve as the wire deformer and hit the return key once again. So now you can see with our curve still selected, we have that pinkish highlight showing that there's a connection into the head mesh. Let's open our hypergraph and quickly rename these nodes. So our curve, we're going to call that K01, head, wire. And our deformer has created a base wire. So I'm going to quickly rename this K01 head and then leave the base wire suffix. Let's hide our head mesh again. So now I'm going to hide this rig and I'm going to hide the live curve, select the base wire, and toggle its visibility on. Switch to component mode. Drag select over all the CVs of the base wire. We're going to create a cluster. Deform, create cluster. Let's open the option box. Make sure that this is set to non-relative, so disable relative. Hit create. So we have a single cluster. Quickly rename this cluster node. Calling it head base CSR for cluster. Okay, so I'm going to unhide the live wire and rehide the base wire. I'm going to create, hide these joints for a second, 3 CVs on the live wire, or 3 clusters on the live wire. The first cluster will have the first 2 CVs as their members, the second cluster the center CV, and the last cluster the 2 end CVs. So we'll select these 2, deform, cluster once again, center CV, I'm going to hit the G key, then the last 2, hit the G key. Let's quickly rename these. Calling this Cave 01 Wire 01 CSR. This is Wire 02. This will be Wire 03. Okay, so now we have a total of 4 clusters. The first 2 clusters, the one which encompasses all the CVs of the base wire, as well as the first 2 CVs of the live wire, we'll never touch those. So I'm going to select those and template them. Display, Object Display, Template. I'm going to select all 4 clusters and parent them to our head 01 joint. So I'm just using the P key. It creates these group nodes to preserve their position. Switch back to a perspective view. I'm going to select all of them and deal with their channel box attributes. I'm going to hide the visibility. I'm going to lock and hide the scaling since that has no effect. Also lock and hide the rotate for all but the last cluster. Actually, I can lock and hide the translates on the first 2 clusters as well, since we're never going to touch them. Okay, so now I'm going to display the head geometry. Select this end cluster and translate it around. So you can see our wire deformer. It's working, but it has a very limited deformation range. So that's easy to fix. We'll just select our geometry, find our wire deformer in the channel box, and set its drop-off distance to 99. Now when we select this cluster, deformations taper all the way back to the base of the jaw. Same is true for the second cluster. So we'll select our geometry and click on the input for selected object, and then click on the all inputs and make sure that our wire is at the top of the list. That way it fires last in the deformation hierarchy. That's good. So now let's look at this. One thing we want to make sure of is that our wire tracks along with the head with its base movements. Okay, so in this case both the live and the base wire are moving together, so there are no deformations with this movement. So if we go to a frame like this, let's find our cluster. So you can see how we can layer this deformation on top of the base head deformations. In the NCV, we can actually rotate as well, since it controls two, or the N cluster controls two CVs. So you can see how we can get a quick, pretty extreme smear on the head. By using this wire deformer. It's again pretty easy to set up. We set up a similar thing in the skinning DVD. Pretty easy to set up, but pretty powerful nonetheless. So this is a quick one frame move where he's turning his head from left to right. You can see how you can smear or drag over one or two frames this whole facial geometry to accentuate that move. Something, a common thing in 2D animation. Just a principle we're going to apply in 3D. Let's go to some frames here where we're dealing with like mouth poses and show that this still works. And once again, it's layered on top of all the blend shape and skin cluster deformations. Because that's a very broad additive deformation. Another step we want to take just as a precaution, right now when we look at this cluster here, okay, let's select the cluster. You can see our deformations, stopping pretty much at the base of the skull. But just as a precaution, I'm going to explicitly paint the fall off of this wire deformer. So with the mesh selected, I'm going to select Deform, Paint Wire Weights tool, and open the option box. My opacity is set to 1 or 100%. I'm using the solid brush. My paint operation is replace, and my value is at 0. So from the jawline back, I'm going to paint all those weights to 0, just to make sure that we have an explicit limit to the wire deformations. And you can go in based on the your character design and explicitly paint this fall off as best suits your particular character. If you're getting good default performance from the wire, this isn't a necessary step, but a good precaution to take. It's often best to go in and explicitly define these types of deformations, or all deformations for that matter, just to later on when you're troubleshooting and the something that will go wrong inevitably does, you'll know that that's one less thing you have to think about because you've gone in and explicitly painted these maps. So if you're getting an odd deformation, you can sort of rule that out. So there are the weights for that wire explicitly defined. Okay, so now you can see back in the throat it's not affecting that much. We can go in and taper these weights here. Set this to 0.5. This is a very broad deformer, so the weighting on this, tends not to be that, I won't say refined, but that much finessed. I'll go one row back and go 0.25. I'm just going in 0.25 or 25% increments. Okay. Okay, so that does it for adding in a smear control. Once again, it's layered in the deformation chain, so it follows last in the deformation order. So it layers on top of everything that's being done here. And a good way of adding some extreme deformations to some of your faster and more broad motions for this character. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy to do, but very effective. And you can see, because it's a standard wire deformer, a very fast feedback with this deformation.